The wind was a blade of ice, honed on the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, and driven with malicious intent into the world of men. It scoured the high passes, stripping the pines of their dignity, and turning the snow from a blanket into a shroud of fine, stinging glass. Boone Cartwright felt it in his bones, a deep, resonant ache that spoke of too many winters spent alone and too many miles with only the creak of saddle leather for company. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, lowered its head against the gale, each step a reluctant plunge into the blinding white. Boone's face was a mask of chapped leather and frozen beard, his eyes narrowed to slits, scanning a landscape that had erased all its features, leaving only the hostile purity of the storm. He was weary, a condition so constant it felt less like a feeling and more like a part of his own skin. He was a man adrift, pushed by circumstance from one lonely vista to the next, seeking not a home, but merely a place to rest for a moment before the world moved him along again. It was this weariness, this profound isolation, that made the splash of color so jarring. Against the overwhelming monochrome of the blizzard, a patch of dark turquoise and crimson lay half buried in a drift. At first he thought it was a discarded trade blanket, a foolish loss in such weather. But as Dust fought closer, a shape resolved itself beneath the fabric, a human shape. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking deep, the cold instantly biting at his legs. He knelt, his gloved hands brushing away the snow. It was a woman, Apache by her deerskin dress, and the intricate beadwork on her moccasins. Her face was ashen, her lips a faint, terrifying blue. Her black hair was fanned out against the snow, dusted with white, like a fallen raven. She was so still, so utterly surrendered to the cold, that he thought he was too late. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, fumbling under the line of her jaw. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Then, a flicker, a beat so faint and slow it was more a memory of life than life itself. Compassion, raw and unthinking, surged through him, a current of warmth in his own frozen veins. It wasn't a choice, it was an impulse, as primal as drawing a breath. He couldn't leave her. The world was harsh enough without a man turning his back on another soul at the very lip of the grave. He worked quickly, his movements clumsy in the wind. He couldn't lift her onto Dust, not without a struggle that might kill them both. The nearest sign of life was Murphy's trading post, maybe 2 hours' ride if the storm relented, 4 if it didn't. He had to get her warm. He looked down at himself, at the heavy sheepskin coat that was his only real protection. Giving it up was a death sentence for him. Then his eyes fell to the bedroll tied behind his saddle. Inside was his one true comfort, the thing that had traveled with him from the hardscrabble farm in Missouri he'd left a decade ago. It was a wool blanket, woven by his grandmother in simple, honest stripes of sky blue and storm gray. It was heavy, dense, and imbued with the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and a life he'd lost. It was his last connection to a past, to a person who had loved him without condition. He untied the bedroll with numb fingers, the leather straps stiff and uncooperative. He shook the blanket out, the familiar weight of it a comfort even in the howling wind. Without a second thought, he wrapped it around the still form of the Apache woman, tucking it tightly around her shoulders, her legs, over her head, leaving only a small space for her to breathe. The vibrant colors of her own clothes were swallowed by the muted blue and gray. It was a simple act, a practical one. In his world, it meant one thing. Here is warmth. Here is a chance. He had no way of knowing that in hers, it meant something else entirely. He managed to heave her into the saddle, settling her in front of him, her dead weight a leaden anchor. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his own body a shield against the wind. "Just hold on," he muttered into the storm, the words stolen from his lips and thrown into the white chaos. "Just hold on." He urged Dust forward, one man and a near-dead woman wrapped in a promise he didn't know he'd made, moving slowly through a world that had no pity. He was simply a man trying to save a life, naive to the cataclysmic shift his simple act of kindness had set in motion, unaware that he was no longer adrift, but anchored to a fate he could never have imagined. The trading post was less a building and more a scar on the landscape, a squat structure of mud and raw timber that seemed to huddle against the foothills for protection. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a greasy black plume that was the most beautiful thing Boone had ever seen. He practically fell from the saddle, his legs numb and useless. He carried the woman inside, the sudden warmth and the smell of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies and curing hides overwhelming his senses. The place fell silent. Murphy, the owner, a man whose face was a roadmap of bad deals and hard winters, looked up from behind his counter, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. 4 other men, trappers and prospectors by their look, stopped their low conversation, their eyes fixing on Boone and his burden. "Christ almighty, Boone," Murphy grunted, wiping his hands on a filthy apron. "What in God's name did you drag in from that storm?" "Found her in a pass, near frozen," Boone rasped, his throat raw. He gently laid her on the floor near the pot-bellied stove, the blue and gray blanket stark against the rough-hewn planks. One of the men, a gaunt figure with a puckered scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer, stepped forward. "An Apache," he said, the word a curse. "You should have left her for the wolves, Cartwright. One less off 'em to worry about." Boone ignored him, kneeling beside the woman. Her breathing was a little stronger now, a shallow but regular whisper. He carefully unwrapped the blanket from her head. In the firelight, he could see she was young, maybe 20 years old. Her features were fine and strong, even in their deathly pallor. "Get some water on to boil," Boone said to Murphy, his voice carrying an authority born of desperation. "And any broth you got." Murphy, for all his gruffness, was a pragmatist. A dead body in his post was bad for business. He shuffled off to the back. The scarred man and his companions, however, edged closer. Their eyes weren't on the woman's face, but on the blanket that covered her. There was a low, predatory murmur among them. "That's a good blanket," the scarred man said, his gaze greedy. "She won't be needing it for long. I'll give you 2 bits for it." "It's not for sale," Boone said, his voice low and cold. He positioned himself between them and the woman, a silent warning. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. These were men who saw the world in terms of what could be taken, and they saw a lone man and a helpless woman as an opportunity. The act of watching, of being watched, began here. Their hungry, judgmental eyes were a physical weight, pressing on him. He felt like an exhibit, the fool who brought a wolf into the henhouse. Suddenly, the heavy plank door swung open, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of frigid air. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the quiet of anticipation. It was the quiet of fear. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the white storm. They were tall, wrapped in buffalo hides, their faces stoic and impassive. Apache warriors. They carried no rifles, only lances and bows, but their presence was more intimidating than any firearm. The man in the lead was older, his face a mask of deep lines and serene authority. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes held the wisdom of seasons. Beside him stood a younger man, broad-shouldered and radiating a fierce, contained energy. His gaze was sharp and hostile, and it locked onto Boone with an unnerving intensity. This, Boone would later learn, was Kuruk. The scarred man and his friends shuffled back, their bravado evaporating like mist. Even Murphy froze mid-stride, a tin pot in his hand. The warriors stepped inside, their moccasins silent on the floorboards. Their eyes swept the room, missing nothing, before they fell upon the woman on the floor. The older man, Nalnish, knelt beside her. He showed no surprise, no panic. He simply placed a hand on her forehead, a gesture of profound tenderness. The younger warrior, Kuruk, looked from the woman to Boone, and then his eyes narrowed, fixing on the blue and gray blanket that covered her. A flicker of something dangerous, something akin to outrage, crossed his face. Nalnish spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. He spoke not to Boone, but to the woman, his words soft in the Apache tongue. Her eyelids fluttered. She stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first. Then they found the face of the old man. She whispered his name. Chasey. Grandfather. Nalnish then looked at Boone. He didn't look angry. He looked grave. He said something in his language, his gaze steady. Boone shook his head. I don't understand. Murphy stepped forward, his voice a nervous tremor. He's Nalnish, an elder. The girl is his granddaughter, Ayana. He's asking by what right you have claimed her. Boone's blood ran cold. Claimed her? I didn't claim anything. I found her. She was dying. Murphy licked his dry lips, his eyes darting between the stoic Apache and the bewildered cowboy. Boone, that blanket, your blanket. What you did, it's not just giving warmth. For them, it's a declaration. A man gives a woman his blanket, a blanket from his family. It's a marriage proposal, a binding one, and since she was unconscious, unable to refuse it, she has accepted it. In their law, she is now your wife. The world tilted on its axis. The simple, humane impulse had become a trap. The wool woven by his grandmother was now the iron of a cage. He looked at the warriors, at the hostile glare of Kuruk, who was Ayana's intended suitor. He looked at Ayana, who was now pushing herself up, her gaze confused as it moved from her grandfather to Boone, then down to the familiar blue and gray fabric that was not her own. He saw the dawning horror in her eyes. The scarred man and his friends were snickering in the corner, enjoying the spectacle. Boone was surrounded, watched by the prejudiced settlers who saw him as a fool, and watched by the implacable Apache who saw him as something far worse. A thief who had stolen not a horse or a weapon, but a daughter. The air in the trading post crackled with a tension that the blizzard outside could not match. His act of compassion had not saved a life. It had entangled two, and in doing so, had likely condemned his own. The journey to the Apache village was a silent ordeal. Boone rode dust, while Ayana rode with her grandfather, her face turned away, a stony profile of shame and confusion. Kuruk and the other warrior flanked them, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. Every rustle of the wind in the pines, every snap of a twig, felt like a judgment. The landscape itself seemed to watch him, the tall saguaros like silent sentinels, the rocks like hooded figures. He was a prisoner, not in chains, but bound by a misunderstanding more potent than any rope. The blue and gray blanket was now folded neatly and held by Nalnish, an object of evidence, a contract Boone had unknowingly signed with his heart. The village was nestled in a hidden canyon, a collection of wickiups and more permanent adobe structures blending seamlessly with the red rock. It was a place of life and order. The scent of cedar smoke and roasting corn hung in the air. Children stopped their play to stare, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. Women paused their work, grinding corn or stretching hides, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and concern. Boone felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, each one stripping away a layer of his identity, leaving him raw and exposed. He was not Boone Cartwright, the man. He was the white man, the outsider, the source of the disruption that had rippled through their community. He was led to the center of the village, before a larger structure that served as a council lodge. An older woman emerged, her face a mask of fierce, unyielding pride. Her eyes, as black and sharp as obsidian chips, swept over Boone with undisguised contempt before landing on Ayana. This was Imala, Ayana's grandmother, the matriarch of their family. She spoke sharp, clipped words to Nalnish, her gaze never leaving Boone. Her hostility was a physical force, a wall of indignation he could feel pressing against him. Ayana flinched under her grandmother's glare, pulling her own blanket tighter around her shoulders as if to ward off the woman's disapproval. They were ushered inside the lodge. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and herbs. A fire burned in the center, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the dozen or so elders who sat waiting. Boone was made to stand before them, A specimen under examination. Nalnish stood and spoke, his voice calm and measured. He recounted the events as he understood them, holding up the blue and gray blanket at the end. A low murmur ran through the elders. Kuruk then stepped forward, his voice a stark contrast to Nalnish's. It was loud, angry, filled with the fire of a man whose honor had been challenged. He pointed at Boone, his words like thrown stones. He spoke of his own courtship of Ayana, of the horses he had offered her family, of the future that had been understood. This outsider, he argued, this Pinda Likoyi, had stolen her through trickery, using the storm as his accomplice. He had violated their customs, defiled their honor. Kuruk's demand was simple and brutal, the man's life in exchange for the insult. Boone stood silent, understanding nothing of the words, but everything of the tone. He felt the weight of his impending death settle over him. He was in their world, under their law, and the law was calling for his blood. He looked at Ayana. She sat beside her grandmother, her head bowed, a silent participant in a drama that would decide her fate as much as his. He saw a single tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. And in that moment, something shifted within him. He was not a thief, he was not a defiler. But his actions, regardless of his intent, had brought this shame upon her. His simple kindness had become her cage. He could try to explain, to plead his ignorance, but words were cheap. The scarred man at the trading post had judged him on his race. Kuruk was judging him on his actions. And looking at Ayana's tear, Boone knew that only one of those judgments mattered. Nalnish turned to him, Murphy having been brought along to translate, his voice now trembling with the gravity of the situation. Kuruk demands your death. He says you have stolen what was to be his. The law is on his side. The council listens. The finality of it was like a physical blow. Die here in the dust for a blanket or... what? The alternative flashed through his mind. Accept the marriage. Live this life, a prisoner of a culture he didn't understand, with a woman who looked at him with fear and shame. Both were a kind of death. He thought of running, but he knew he wouldn't get 100 yards. He was trapped. The weariness he felt in the storm was nothing compared to the exhaustion of this moment. Then he looked at Nalnish, at the old man's eyes. They were not filled with hatred like Kuruk's, or contempt like Imala's. They were filled with a deep, sorrowful wisdom. They were the eyes of a man weighing the balance of tradition and circumstance. And Boone saw a third path, not an escape, but a confrontation. Tell him, Boone said, his voice quiet but steady, forcing Murphy to lean in. Tell him I will not accept a marriage I did not seek. It would be a dishonor to me and to her. He paused, gathering his resolve. And I will not abandon the responsibility of my actions. I will not disgrace her by denying the meaning of the blanket. If Kuruk believes I am unworthy, if he believes I am a coward and a thief with no honor, then let me prove him wrong. Murphy translated, his voice faltering. A hush fell over the lodge. Kuruk scoffed, a look of disbelief on his face. Boone pressed on, his gaze locked with Nalnish's. I did not know your laws, that is my ignorance, but I know the law of a man's heart. My heart meant only to save her. If your ways demand a price for that act, I will not pay it with her life or mine in a forced union. I will pay it with a test. Give me a trial. Give me a chance to prove that the spirit that offered the blanket is a spirit worthy of your respect, even if the man was ignorant of your ways. This was his point of no return. He was no longer trying to escape his situation. He was committing to it, on their terms. He was placing his life not in the hands of fate, but in the crucible of their judgment. Murphy finished translating, his words hanging in the smoky air. Imala looked at him with a flicker of something other than pure hatred. Kuruk's anger was now mixed with a grudging curiosity. It was Nalnish who held the final decision. The old man studied Boone for a long time, his eyes searching for the truth behind the words. He saw not a frightened white man begging for his life, but a man, cornered and out of his depth, trying to forge honor out of a disaster. Finally, Nalnish spoke, his voice resonating with authority. The law is the law, but the spirit of the law seeks balance. An act of the heart has created this imbalance. It must be answered by the heart. He looked at Kuruk, then at the council. Then his eyes settled on Boone. Murphy's translation came, slow and deliberate. He says your death would be easy. A forced marriage would be a lingering poison. Your offer is a new path. The council will allow it. They will test you. 3 trials, to be completed between this sunrise and the next. A trial of strength, to prove your body is not weak. A trial of wisdom, to prove your mind is not foolish. And a trial of sacrifice, to prove your heart is not empty. If you succeed in all 3, you will have earned the right to stand among them. Ayana's honor will be restored, and you will be free to choose your path, as will she. But if you fail even one, you will die. The weight of the choice settled on Boone. It was no choice at all, but it was everything. It was the chance to define himself not by his mistake, but by his response to it. He looked at Ayana one last time. Her head was no longer bowed. She was looking at him, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was mixed with a fragile, terrifying spark of hope. I accept, Boone said. And in the silence of the lodge, he felt the world lock into place. The path ahead was one of pain and probable death, but it was a path he had chosen. He had offered up his life to be measured, and the scales were now set. The first trial began immediately. There was no time for rest, no moment to contemplate the enormity of his wager. Nalnish led him from the lodge into the cold, thin air of the high canyon. The entire village followed, a silent procession of witnesses. Kuruk walked near the front, his arms crossed, a smug, predatory confidence in his stride. He believed this white man, softened by his own world, would break easily. Imala watched from a distance, her expression unreadable now, her judgment suspended. Ayana stood with her grandmother, her face pale, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. They stopped at the base of a sheer cliff face, a vertical expanse of red sandstone that soared hundreds of feet into the piercing blue sky. It was not perfectly smooth. There were cracks and ledges, but they looked perilously small, like scars on an unscalable wall. High above, nestled in a weathered cavity near the summit, was an eagle's nest. Nalnish pointed upward. The trial of strength, Murphy translated, his voice strained. The eagle is the messenger to the Creator. It sees all. It is fierce, and holds its territory with its life. Your test is to climb the cliff. You must retrieve a single feather from the nest and bring it back. Boone stared up at the cliff, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. It wasn't just a climb. It was an invasion of a sacred space, a direct challenge to a creature that was the embodiment of wild, untamable power. He was already exhausted, his body aching from the storm and the sleepless night. He was a cowboy, strong in the saddle, but this was a different kind of strength, a test of fingers and toes, of endurance and raw nerve. Kuruk stepped forward and spoke, a sharp, challenging tone in his voice. Murphy translated. He says he made this climb when he was a boy of 15. He wonders if a grown white man has the strength of an Apache youth. The challenge was a public goad, meant to unnerve him. Boone ignored him. He stripped off his heavy coat, leaving himself in his worn shirt and trousers. The cold air bit at him instantly. He looked at his hands, calloused from reins and rope, but he knew they were not ready for this. He took a deep breath, the thin mountain air burning his lungs, and began to climb. The first 50 feet were a desperate scramble for purchase. The rock was cold and unforgiving, scraping his knuckles raw, tearing at his fingertips. Every handhold was a gamble, every foothold a prayer. The wind, his old enemy from the storm, found him again, plucking at him, trying to unseat him from his precarious perch. The crowd below grew smaller, their faces upturned, a sea of silent judgment. He could feel Kuruk's eyes on him, willing him to fall, but he could also feel Ayana's. He risked a glance down and saw her, a small figure standing apart, her gaze fixed on him. That gaze was a rope, pulling him upward. He forced himself into a rhythm, a painful cadence of pull, push, breathe. He stopped thinking about the height, about the fall. He thought only of the next hold, the next ledge. His world shrank to the few feet of rock around him. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and a coppery taste of blood and exhaustion filled his mouth. He was 100 feet up, then 200. The eagle's nest was closer now, a messy jumble of sticks and branches wedged into the rock. And then the eagle appeared. It launched itself from the nest with a piercing shriek that echoed across the canyon. It was a magnificent, terrifying creature, its wingspan wider than a man is tall. It circled once, its golden eyes locking onto the intruder, and then it dove. Boone pressed himself flat against the rock as the talons raked the air where his head had been. The wind from its wings was a physical blow. It shrieked again, a sound of pure fury, and banked for another attack. This was the true test. Not just the climb, but the climb while under assault from the very spirit of the mountain. He knew he couldn't fight it. He could only endure. He found a slightly deeper crevice and wedged his body in as best he could, protecting his face with one arm as the eagle swooped again and again. Its talons tore at his shirt, scoring his back and shoulders. Pain, sharp and hot, lanced through him. He gritted his teeth, the agony focusing his mind. He was an invader here. He deserved this punishment. But he had to succeed. During a brief lull as the eagle circled higher, he pushed onward, his movements frantic. He was just below the nest now. He could see the fledglings inside, their heads bobbing. The mother eagle let out a final, desperate cry and dove one last time. Boone didn't flinch. He reached up, his fingers stretching, just as the talons grazed his cheek, leaving a searing line of fire. His hand closed around a single, long, black-tipped feather that lay on the edge of the nest. He plucked it free. He had it. The descent was a controlled fall, a slithering, sliding agony. He didn't care about grace, only about getting down. His muscles had turned to water. His hands were numb and bleeding, and his body was a canvas of new pains. When his feet finally touched the ground, his legs gave out and he collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air, the world spinning around him. He held up the feather. It was stained with his own blood. A low murmur went through the crowd. Kuruk's face was a mask of disbelief and reluctant respect. He had climbed the cliff, yes, but he had not faced a nesting mother in her full fury. Boone had not just shown strength, he had shown a terrifying endurance. He had bled on their sacred mountain and had not been broken. Nalnish stepped forward and took the feather from his trembling hand. He looked at the blood on it, then at the gash on Boone's cheek, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The first trial was over. There was no respite. As Boone struggled to his feet, his body screaming in protest, Nalnish led him to a clearing where a single, large, smooth stone sat, weathered by centuries of sun and rain. It was an ancestor stone, a place of memory and contemplation. "The trial of wisdom," Murphy said, his voice softer now, tinged with a sliver of awe. "This stone has been here since the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers. It has seen all our sorrows and all our joys. Nalnish will ask you one riddle. Your answer will show if your mind sees only the surface of things, or if you can understand the heart of our world." Boone's mind was a fog of pain and exhaustion. Wisdom felt 1,000,000 miles away. He could barely think, let alone solve a riddle. Kuruk looked on, his confidence returning. A man could be strong like a bear, but foolish like one too. This would be where the white man's alien mind would fail. Nalnish placed a hand on the warm stone, his expression serene. He spoke, his voice low and rhythmic, less a question and more a philosophical invocation. Murphy translated carefully. He asks, "I have a memory of every leaf that has fallen, yet I have no mind. I have a skin that has been touched by every ancestor, yet I have no body. I hold the story of our people, but I have no voice. What am I?" Boone stared at the stone, his thoughts sluggish. His intellect, The part of him that would try to solve this like a puzzle in a book was useless. The answer wasn't about logic. It was about perspective. A memory of every leaf? Touched by every ancestor? A story with no voice? His mind ran through the obvious answers, the stone itself, the land, the sky. But Nalnish had said the stone had these things, not that it was them. He was being asked to identify a concept, not an object. He closed his eyes, shutting out the expectant faces, the pain in his body. He tried to think not like Boone Cartwright, the cowboy, but like a person whose entire world was this canyon, this history. What held memory without a mind? What held stories without a voice? He thought about his own past, about the farm in Missouri, the faces of his parents. What held that for him? A photograph, a song, an object imbued with meaning. And then he thought about the blanket, his blanket. It held the memory of his grandmother. It had no mind, but it held memory. It had been touched by her, by him, by Ayanna. It had no voice, but it was now telling a story that was deciding his life. The answer wasn't the object itself, but the meaning placed upon it. He thought of the stone. It had been touched by generations. Each touch left a trace, a memory, a story. What was the common thread? He looked at Nalnish, at Imala, at Ayanna. He saw the beadwork on their clothes, the patterns that told a story. He saw the lines on Nalnish's face, a map of his life. He looked at the bloody feather in the elder's hand. It wasn't just a feather anymore. It was a symbol of his trial, of his pain and endurance. The answer came to him not as a clever deduction, but as a quiet understanding. He opened his eyes and looked at Nalnish. "Tell him," Boone said, his voice hoarse. "Tell him the answer is honor." Murphy translated. A profound stillness fell over the clearing. Boone continued, finding the words as he spoke them. "Honor has a memory of every deed, good and bad, like the leaves. But it is not a mind, it is a standard. The honor of your people has been touched by every ancestor. They have lived and died by it. But it is not a physical body. It is a spirit. And honor holds the story of your people. It is in every promise kept, every trial faced, every sacrifice made. It has no voice of its own, but it speaks through the actions of every man and woman." He looked directly at Kuruk. "It speaks when a boy climbs a cliff, and it speaks when a stranger bleeds on your mountain to answer for a mistake he did not understand." Silence. The canyon itself seemed to be holding its breath. Kuruk's jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. Imala's severe face softened for just an instant, a flicker of grudging acknowledgement. Ayanna's eyes were wide, and in them, the spark of hope burned brighter. Nalnish's face broke into a slow, deep smile. He placed his hand on Boone's shoulder, a gesture of profound acceptance. "His mind is not foolish," Nalnish said in his own tongue, and this time, no translation was needed. The second trial was over. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. Boone was swaying on his feet, his reserves almost completely gone. The physical agony of the climb and the mental exhaustion of the riddle had stripped him down to his very core. But the hardest trial was yet to come. Nalnish led him back to the central fire, which now burned brightly against the gathering dusk. The entire village was assembled in a solemn circle. This was the final crucible. "The trial of sacrifice," Murphy announced, his voice now filled with a somber respect. "Strength of the body is good, wisdom of the mind is better. But the measure of a man's soul is what he is willing to lose for the sake of others. You must give up the thing you value most, not what is most valuable in money, but what is most precious to your spirit. You must offer it to the fire, to release its hold on you, to show that your heart is not empty, but ready to make a new home." What did he value most? His horse? Dust? The animal was his partner, his freedom. His pistol? It was his life, his protection. But these were tools of survival. Nalnish was asking for something deeper. What was most precious to his spirit? He thought of the blue and gray blanket. It was the cause of all this, but it was also his last link to his grandmother, to his past. It was profoundly important, but it was no longer truly his. It was a part of this story now, a shared object. Giving it up would be a symbol, but would it be the deepest sacrifice? No. There was one other thing, something he hadn't looked at in months, but which he carried everywhere. Something that was his alone, a secret anchor to the life he'd left behind. With a trembling hand, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, the one he had left on the ground. He pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted a small, faded photograph, its corners soft with age. It was the only one he had, a sepia-toned image of a young man and woman, their faces honest and kind, standing in front of a simple farmhouse. His parents. They had died of fever within a week of each other when he was 16, leaving him utterly alone. This small, fragile piece of paper was his entire history. It was the proof that he had come from somewhere, that he had been loved. It was his connection to the name Cartwright, to the boy he had been. Giving it up wouldn't just be giving up an object. It would be letting go of his ghosts. It would be severing the final tie to his old identity. He looked at the photo, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. He saw his mother's smile, his father's steady gaze. He remembered the feel of his father's hand on his shoulder, the sound of his mother's voice calling him home. To burn this would be to accept that that home was gone forever. It would be to say goodbye. He looked up and met Ayana's gaze across the fire. He saw in her eyes the reflection of his own conflict, the pain of being caught between two worlds. To build a new home, you had to be willing to leave the old one. He took a ragged breath. This was the price, not for his freedom, but for his honor, and for hers. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the fire. The heat washed over his face. He held the photograph over the flames, his hand shaking violently. For a moment he faltered. This was too much. This was the core of him. But then he thought of the life he had lived, a life of drifting, of being an outsider everywhere. He thought of the men at the trading post who judged him by his skin, and the life of lonely survival that awaited him if he walked away. And he looked at Ayana, at the possibility of a home not found, but forged. With a choked sob that was torn from the deepest part of him, he let the photograph go. It caught instantly. The faces of his parents curled, turned black, and dissolved into ash and smoke, spiraling up into the night sky. He watched until it was completely gone. An unbearable emptiness washed over him, followed by a strange, terrifying peace. He had done it. He had cut the cord. He was no longer Boone Cartwright, the farmer's son from Missouri. He was just a man, standing before a fire in an Apache canyon, his past turned to ash. He had given up everything. He turned to face the council, his face pale and tear-streaked in the firelight, but his back was straight. He had nothing left to lose. He had been stripped of his strength, his pride, and finally, his past. A profound silence held the village. Then Kuruk, his face a complex mask of shock and awe, stepped forward. He walked not to Nalnish, but to Boone. He stood before him for a long moment, and then he gave a single sharp nod. It was not friendship. It was respect. Hard-earned, grudging, but undeniable. He had seen a sacrifice he understood, and it had changed his view of the man he saw as his rival. Then another figure moved. Imala, the fierce matriarch, the guardian of tradition, the woman whose eyes had been filled with contempt, walked to him. She carried a clay bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. She said nothing. She simply began to clean the bloody, eagle-scratched gash on his cheek. Her touch was firm, but gentle. It was an act of healing, an act of acceptance more powerful than any words. It was the gesture of a mother tending to a son. The trials were over. He had not failed. The days that followed were quiet, filled with a sense of gentle recovery. His wounds were tended to by Imala, his exhaustion slowly faded, replaced by a feeling of profound, resonant peace. He was no longer a prisoner, no longer a defendant. He was a guest, an object of curiosity and a quiet respect. The children no longer stared at him as an intruder, but with a shy friendliness. The warriors nodded as he passed. He had not become one of them, but he was no longer an outsider. He had earned his place to stand among them. Nalnish gave him back the blue and gray wool blanket. It looked different now. The colors seemed deeper, the fabric heavier, imbued with the weight of the trials, the sacrifice, and the acceptance. It was no longer a link to his past, nor was it the chain of an unwanted contract. It was something new. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the canyon in soft pastels, Ayana came to him. She had been quiet in the days since the final trial, watching him from a distance, her own conflict slowly resolving. She carried the blanket, holding it out to him. "This is yours," she said, her voice soft. It was the first time she had spoken to him in English. "It is," he said, his voice quiet. "But it doesn't mean what I thought it meant." "No," she agreed. "In my world it was a promise. A claim." She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. "You did not run from that promise. You faced the fire for it. You gave up your ghosts for it. You have honored my family, and you have honored me." He could only nod, his heart too full for words. She unfolded the blanket, the familiar blue and gray stripes catching the twilight. "The elders say you have earned your freedom. You may take your horse and go. No one will stop you. Your honor is clean." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "They also say my honor is clean. I am free to choose my own path now." This was the moment, the culmination of everything. He was free to ride away, back to his lonely world of drifting. And she was free to marry Karuk, or any other man of her tribe, and live the life that had been planned for her. The slate was clean. He looked at her, at the strength and resilience in her face, at the quiet intelligence in her eyes. He thought of the world beyond the canyon, the world of men like the one with the scar, a world of prejudice and lonely survival. He thought of the ashes of his past, spiraling into the night sky. He had no home to return to. "What path will you choose?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ayana held his gaze. She took one end of the blanket, and she held it out to him. "Home is not a place you find," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It is a thing you build. It is built with strength and with wisdom and with sacrifice." She draped one end of the blanket over his shoulders. Then she drew the other end over her own. They stood together, wrapped in the single piece of fabric, the space between them bridged by the soft wool. "I choose to build it here, with you." Tears welled in Boone's eyes, not of sorrow or sacrifice, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of arrival. He had stumbled into this canyon a weary, isolated man, naive to its ways. He had been stripped of everything he was, and in that emptiness, he had found something he had never even known he was searching for. He reached up, and his hand covered hers where she held the blanket. It wasn't the end of all their problems. The world outside the canyon was still there. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and hardships. But for the first time in his life, Boone Cartwright was not alone. He was not adrift. The act of watching and being watched had ended, replaced by the act of seeing and being seen. He had earned this peace, one splinter and one scar at a time. He was home.